Okay, there we go. Okay, and now just to introduce Len. Len von Morzé is associate professor of English and dean of the Honors College at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He has co-authored an introduction to the first reprinting of Ralston's novel Monima, or The Beggar Girl, since its first publication in 1802, and has written extensively on novels in the early United States. He's also an avid participant in our transcription group. And I'll give the floor to Len.
Thank you so much, Bettina. And thank you to the Horner Library Committee for inviting me to talk about the project that I just finished with Betsy Klima, which is as Bettina said, the first reprinting of this novel since its most recent publication in 1803. There was a kind of butchered version in the mid-19th century that reprinting, but I won't go into that here. Bettina gave me entirely too much credit, I should say, for discovering the identity of this novelist. We'll see that it's another scholar who learned that Mary Endress Ralston had written these novels, but I think my particular interest in it comes precisely from the work um, with the GSP transcription group, and I'm so pleased to see members of that group here. And I think without that work, this project really wouldn't be possible. Yeah, so I'll just say that I'll advance the slide, and hopefully you can all see the first slide. So. Critics have long been fascinated by this novel, Monima, especially in the last 20 years, where there's been quite a number of articles and studies of this novel that have come out. I think it's really to use a subjective judgment, I suppose, one of the most readable novels of the first decade of the 19th century, published in the United States. It was apparently pretty popular in its own day. It went through three different editions, in 1802 in New York, in 1803 in New York, and then an 1803 Philadelphia edition. To be entirely, accurate bibliographically speaking, these are really three editions, but two printings. So the New York printings here of Monima, the novel, were identical as far as I can tell, other than the title page. But the Philadelphia editions there are quite a number of differences between that and the New York edition. So it was a pretty strong print run for a novel in this time period, I think, or at least a number of editions, I should say more accurately. It was nothing like the most popular novel of its era, the best-selling Charlotte Temple. But it was still a pretty remarkably successful book, according to the leading critic of or historian of the early American novel, Kathy Davidson. The basic story of Nima was plagiarized by authors and printers throughout the 19th century. So it was quite a hit in its own time. Um, you can see the images of the title pages here. These are from the American Antiquarian Society copies. The New York printings were signed by an American lady on the title page. And the Philadelphia printing, not surprisingly, is said to be written by a lady of Philadelphia. So um, we didn't know who that person was. But before getting into the authorship question, I want to say something about why this novel is so interesting. Um, it's, I think, one of the first realistic representations of the lives of the poor in an urban setting in the United States. Um, the author, as a sign of that, used the phrase "how the other half lives." How the other half lives. This is 80 years before Jacob Riis wrote his famous study of the poor in New York by that title. Like Riis, the author of this novel explored social fractures in a city where people had diverse origins and different levels of social power. Other authors of the time also chronicled racial and ethnic conflict in Philadelphia, but Monima kind of rather uniquely, I think, linked social class to immigration status and to language, to native language. So it's a multilingual city in the account of this novelist. Um, so for about 100 years, to come back to this authorship question, the novel was ascribed to a writer named Martha Meredith Reed. And this was the work of a great bibliographer of the American novel named Lyle Wright. In the 1930s, he was trying to come up with the name of an author for every novel that was published in early America. And as far as I can tell, he must have looked in the city directory and found an MR, a Lady of Philadelphia. And so he nominated Martha Meredith Reed as as the author of Monima. The attribution didn't really have a lot going for it, other than that Martha Meredith Reed was wealthy. We don't have evidence of her writing, let alone of writing novels, but it was presumed, I think, by Wright and then by Kathy Davidson, who followed, that the author of this novel about the lives of the poor must have been very wealthy and must have been observing the poor from a distance, with sympathy, no doubt, but with a kind of detachment, and with not really a firsthand experience of that life. Um, the other interesting thing, I suppose, about Martha Meredith Reed is that she was married to a very prominent Philadelphia Federalist merchant. And so the novel's politics were assumed to be very Federalist in orientation. And so critics would have to kind of start from that point and try to make an argument about how the novel was Federalist in one way or another. Um, so it wasn't just this one novel that was involved in this attribution question. There were a number of other works that were ascribed to the same author. So this novel, like others at the time, Monima, was initially serialized in a periodical. And I say a periodical because it's somewhat like a magazine, but in a kind of newspaper format in this case, like some other certain other magazines at this time. And you can see that an installment of another novel um, called Margaretta, or The Village Maid, will shortly be handed for publication. And so this is the beginning of that novel, Margaretta, which would not be published in book form until 1807. But you can see that that the writer of this work is also said to have written other things, including Monima and A Second Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is an interesting title. It refers back to Mary Wollstonecraft's famous feminist essay, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And so whoever wrote Monima, in other words, also wrote Margaretta, also wrote Second Vindication of the Rights of Women, and then the head note also says, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's other things that this writer has written, apparently. And having read all of the run of the Ladies Monitor, I think we can pretty confidently say that whoever wrote this work also wrote all the fiction in the magazine, quite a number of the poems that were also included in this magazine. This wasn't, there was a work that I've done with and published on the well-known Philadelphia novelist Charles Braxton Brown, who was writing about the same time period. And we know that Brown, in editing a magazine, we learned that he also came up with most of the content for the magazine. So he was simultaneously the editor of the magazine and also its primary author. Whoever wrote this content in the Ladies Monitor was in a similar situation, I think, writing much of the content for the publication. We do know the author, the editor's name, though. The editor was a guy named of the Ladies Monitor was a guy named Isaac Newton Ralston. So that was an important clue for a scholar who would come around to discover the identity of the author of Monima. So you might ask, why doesn't she put her name here? And why does she remain anonymous? Well, I think it was highly, um, it was common during the time period for women writers to disguise their authorship. For a woman to publish was to um, be involved in a literary marketplace in which you were essentially selling a commodity. And so it was considered shameful for women to have their names on title pages. And here you'll all recognize these two titles. These are the title pages um, of course, the first and second novel by Jane Austen, and you could see that Sensibility, which is written contemporaneously, is said to have been written by a lady without the name Austen, of course. And Pride and Prejudice, her second novel, simply says by the author of Sense and Sensibility. So it's as though the author is leaving breadcrumbs for us to follow, so we can kind of see what new things they've published, but we still don't get their names, right? So we see that the author Monima did the similar thing with her magazine in giving us a little trail to follow as we discover other things that she's written. Um, Now, male writers weren't entirely free from the same kind of, constraints of anonymity. We say that in early America, there was a general culture of Republican anonymity. So, in order to be objective and disinterested, you were generally discouraged from putting your name on books that you'd written. But I think the pressure applied far more to women than to men. So even when the author of Margareta and Monima contacted publishers, she didn't sign her name. So in the letter that the scholar who discovered the identity of Monima um, came across, kind of by chance on his account, the author signs herself incognito. She doesn't put her name there. We don't know who she is. Um, and this scholar was named is named is Thomas Baker, a historian who teaches in the SUNY system. And in his groundbreaking article last year, correcting attribution of the novels Monima and Margareta, he starts with this letter and points out that the author of this letter says that she's just written these two novels, Monima and Margareta, and would like to have a publisher for them um, because she's really poor and needs to sell her fiction to make money for her to support her family. Um, uh, my co-editor, Betsy Klima, and I were both interested in this novel for other reasons without really thinking so much about the authorship question. And we were starting to work on a new edition of Monima when we read this article. And we thought, oh, this is fascinating because I've been working with the GSP and the name of this author, Mary Endress Ralston, the name Endress appears in the GSP records, and it made me perk up and think, how can we think about the context of this of this author's life? And so I'll be turning to Maria Endress's life in just a moment. Um, Maria Endress would eventually go by the name of, well, actually, by the time that this novel was written, by the name Mary Ralston. So she had married a Scots Irishman and had anglicized her name to Mary Ralston. So, aha, that's our MR of the preface to the Philadelphia version of Monima. Um, and so Betsy Klima, who's on this Zoom as well, and I put out this new edition of the novel. If you're interested in purchasing it, you can go to the website here. This is an entirely disinterested pitch. We don't make any money from this edition, and neither does publisher. And if you just want to read our introduction, you can Google Monima and Ralston, and that will come up I think, pretty high on the search results if you're curious about the scholarly version of what we've done. Um, So Thomas Baker's research unearthed a fascinating story that I think members of the GSP will be interested in. Um, Maria Endress was the third child of German immigrants Zechariah Endress, and I constructed a little amateurish family tree here. Um, Zechariah Endress spelled his name with one S in Europe, apparently, before coming to British North America in 1772. He was a fascinating character who was born near Wertheim am Main in Baden-Württemberg. He was apparently sponsored by one of the counts of Löwenstein-Wertheim. He came up the Main River at some point to Frankfurt. He had a university degree from the University of Tübingen. He worked as a brewer in Lyon, France. And as I said, he came to Pennsylvania in 1766, and he met and married a Huguenot refugee, and this will turn out to be quite important, named Anna Sensfeld, pardon me, a with an umlaut. And their third child is our Maria Dorothea Ralston. Um, so Zechariah, or Zacharias as he appears in some records, is not a typical German immigrant of this time period at all. He had a university degree. He had the financial support of aristocrats like the Count, aforementioned. And according to family lore, he had Voltaire as a personal tutor. So this was really not one of the, typical farmers or indentured servants who would come over with the the wave of German immigration in the mid 18th century. Um, Zechariah founded a brewery in Philadelphia, but the family fortunes were dealt a devastating blow by the American Revolution. So he comes over in 1766, and Mariah is born in 1772, and then the American Revolution comes around. Zechariah was on the Patriot or the Whig or the revolutionary side, however you want to refer to it. And his brewery and orchards were apparently destroyed by the British Army. So young Maria, after this prosperous first few years, descends into abject poverty throughout the rest of the 18th century. Her story is interestingly, and I already mentioned Charles Brackman Brown, a little similar to his. Brown had been born a year earlier in Philadelphia, and his father had been, because it was a Quaker family, arrested as a Quaker who refused to take an oath of allegiance to the United States, and also had engaged in some double dealing with mercantile double dealing with the army, apparently. So both families faced financial hardship, and both novelists, interestingly, are fascinated by the lives of the downwardly mobile, people who've lost their fortune. And they're both interested in different ways in economic precarity in the lives of the poor. Uh, so Ralston, as it turns out, would start trying to publish her fiction as a way to make money for her family. She was not like Meredith Reed, a woman of fame, of great fortune and financial well-being. Her brother, a Christian, or I should say Christian, who is pictured here in two drawings, would become the most famous member of the family. He was trained by Justus Helmuth, who, as Bettina mentioned, we're also transcribing in the transcription group. Helmut was the pastor of St. Michael's in Zion in Philadelphia, which was, the great Lutheran church and the largest church edifice in the United States at this time. And Christian, uh, after kind of training under Helmut, would go on to establish English language church services in Lancaster, and this is an important pattern in the family. So, um, like her brother, Mary Endress Ralston would be writing fiction in English and not in German, and I'm going to explore that a little later in this talk. Endress, as I mentioned earlier, would marry a Scots-Irish printer named Isaac Newton Ralston, who published The Lady's Monitor, among other works. So we can see that he was drawing on his talented wife for most of the material in his magazine. Um, After marrying in 1799, Mary and Isaac had a daughter named Matilda who would die at a very young age. I can't figure out whether she was only 1 or 3 when she passed away. And she was 6 months pregnant with another child, with her second child, when Maria started her marketing campaign to try to publish Monima, or the Beggar Girl, as a freestanding book. And as far as we can tell, because nobody's been able to find a historical record of his death, Isaac Newton Ralston just disappeared into the world. And he may have died, he may have abandoned the family. We don't really know. And as a young woman, Ralston was now something like a beggar in the literary marketplace. She would try to find a charitable publisher to take her on. And she did end up finding two printers, as we saw earlier, or three actually, to publish her work. Her fiction, though, as Baker points out, did not focus on the plight of a widow or an abandoned wife, but instead was about the lives of young women who were generally in their teenage years, in the case of Monima and Margareta, and who were facing financial hardship. So, um, Mary Ralston has been known to historians of material culture, and as you can see from her slide, from the slide here, she's been known as a teacher whose students created samplers with a signature style, and samplers are kind of masterworks or capstones of embroidery. And you can see the needlework here is highly valued on the market today. That Ralston produced in the school that she ran from 1813 until 1834. Um, and once their education was complete, young women could bring this work into the home as evidence of their domestic skill. So let's go back to Maria Endress's early life, where she was doing that needlework, and also writing to try to support the family. In this case, as Baker discovered, she's writing to the President of the United States of America to try to raise money for the family. She writes, the little my mother and I earned by spinning, right? So she's doing needlework, was not sufficient to keep us in bread. My father is too aged to labor, and so I utterly despair of ever being able to maintain themselves. It sets the heart bleeding to see my parents, whom I love as I love myself, in this condition without being able to support them in their necessities in the least. So, in that era of, charitable and responsive presidents, George Washington actually wrote back and sent her $5 to try to support the Endress family. Kind of astonishing. Um, but and uh, Maria Endress used the money to try to buy a lottery ticket because, as an 19-year-old, she thought, this is the way we're going to bring our family back to wealth. Alas, the lottery ticket was not a winner, although perhaps for literary history's purposes, it was good that she was writing novels instead, or turned to the idea of writing novels rather than winning the lottery as a way to make money for her family. Um, I mentioned the correspondence to George Washington for another reason, that Maria Endress was deciding, even at this early stage in her late teenage life, to appeal uh, to charity to people who can help her who are not Germans, right? So she grows up speaking German. She's embedded in German Lutheran networks. Her brother would end up becoming this prominent Lutheran pastor. But she decides not to go to the GSP for help, right? So she goes to George Washington, and then she goes to publishers of English who will publish her English language novels. I think this is an important question, in some ways the most central question that I'm talking about today, which is, why doesn't she go to the German Society of Pennsylvania, which, the raison d'etre of the German Society is to provide mutual aid. In the transcription group, looking at the protocols of the um, of the directors of the German Society, we see that much of the content of those books is a precise record of the people who need help from the Mutual Aid Society, how much they receive and when they receive it, right? It turns out that her brothers appear in that book, but she does not. There are plenty of women, of course, who receive charity from the GSP, but Maria Endress's name does not appear in the records. So this is one of the most interesting questions, I think, that led me to think, oh, let's think about this a little bit more. Um, so I think one reason she may have not gone to the GSP later in life, of course, is that she was married to a Scots Irishman. Um, uh, but she also may have been dissatisfied with the way that the GSP had funded the university educations of her brothers, while leaving her, of course, out in the cold. She was not entitled to the same education. Really, as far as we can know, she had very little formal education. Two of her brothers received scholarship funds to attend the University of Pennsylvania, um, as part of the GSP's effort to make Germans, quote, useful citizens, as they explain in the minutes of the GSP. And you see here the diploma that was given to Christian Endress on the left side of the page. And it's actually funny when this is tangentially related, that um, in German newspapers of this time period, they were very proud of sending many Germans to graduate from the University of Pennsylvania, and uh, the commencement day was pretty close to July 4th. So many of the graduates would give a commencement address, or actually would give a July 4th address. And the German language newspapers at the time talk about how many of these July 4th orations were delivered in German, and they would meet with great admiration from even from those who didn't speak German, who were listening to them, who were kind of wowed by their oratorical abilities. And Christian would have been one of those young German-speaking men who had graduated from the university. And we know from GSP records that Christian Endress was also had everything paid for, even his diploma. So the GSP records say, oh well, we came up with 10 to 12 shillings to pay even for the purchase of that diploma. And I'm sure that Maria Ralston is seeing Maria Endress, pardon me, is asking herself, so where's my education? Like how I'm also interested in reading and writing. Um, uh, how am I being supported? We do see, by the way, that Bettina found this interesting record from 1812 or 1813, in which a Witwe, Endress, a widow Endress, is given money. But after tracing the family chart of this family, it appears that the person here would be the wife of Maria's oldest brother, John Zacharias, who had died in 1811. So this isn't actually uh, our Maria Endress Ralston. And I think the presence of this record just makes the point even clearer that Maria or Mary Ralston decided not to go to the GSP for support after the death or the disappearance of her husband. Um, Instead, she writes the novel Monima, or tries to have it published, about a virtuous young woman who's seeking charity from benefactors. Um, and She's trying to find a kindly and receptive audience for her fiction. Um, so we must sense, I think, that Ralston, like other intellectually ambitious women of her cultural moment, women of great talent, were angry about being deprived of an education that would have enabled them to, Maria Andress's brothers, to have the literary accomplishments of men like Charles Braxton Brown. So we can compare her to someone like Abigail Adams, who famously says, remember the women," or Mercy Otis Warren, a woman who wanted to become essentially the dramatist of the American Revolution. Or in this case, there's a clip from Judith Sargent Murray, who spoke about how her brother received an education and she did not. So she felt that she had been robbed of the aids of education. And I imagine Mary Endress Ralston feeling the same way about not being given the same chances that her brothers had been given. Um, so her novels actually kind of set up an interesting and very typical family configuration of this time period, which is um, a daughter who's intellectually ambitious and curious, who is taught by her father. And the mothers in these fictions are always dead. Um, and this is a pattern, I think, in a lot of novels by women at this time period, including Jane Austen, in which mother figures are out of the picture because they didn't have the same, they provide a model for life, unemancipated life that the daughters in these fictions do not want to follow. Instead, there's a deep identification from daughter to father in a lot of this fiction, and we see this in Monima and Margareta as well, in which the life path that the young heroine wants to follow is that of the father rather than of the mother, who's kind of been thrust out of the picture. I think there's other reasons that Maria uh, Endress Ralston didn't want to be known as a novelist, and I think some of it had to do with the dangers that fiction was thought to have for young women. Precisely because girls were not entitled to education, they were vulnerable in the views of many public authorities to the corrupting influence of fiction, which could mislead young minds. And so Endress had to be very careful about embracing novel writing as a career. It wasn't really something that she could do overtly. I don't really have an idea about what Lutheran attitudes toward fictions might have been at this time period, but I imagine it was pretty similar to the views that Anglophone Protestants would have held, where fiction was often regarded as inspiring laziness at best, and maybe sensuality at worst. It didn't mean that all fiction was bad in the same way. And maybe we can think about it in relation to the way we think about movies and young people, perhaps, like where we have a rating system for movies where, I remember well from my teenage years that going to a G or PG or maybe even PG-13 movie, not a problem. an R-rated movie, and we won't even talk about rated X, would be a problem for young people. And we can see that some novels were regarded as particularly dangerous, as R-rated for young women, and were regarded as corrupting their minds. Um, and so short fiction with a moral was the kind of PG rated fiction that was okay by all audiences. And the fiction that was more risque, like Monima in some ways, would be regarded as dangerous for young women to read. I suppose if I just to stick with this conceit, Monima is something like a PG-13 rated movie with some language, some sexual situations, quite a lot of innuendo around this young woman's life. Um, and the novel is nonetheless careful to insist that it was founded on fact, not based on any lascivious images conjured by the imagination. The novel also upholds Monima as a model of virtue and chastity. And there's ways in which we can think of this as being very conservative, perhaps, but it's also modeled as we argue in our introduction, on the most famous novel of the 18th century, Samuel Richardson's Pamela, which is about, well, at least one long section of this novel is modeled on Pamela. And as conservative as it might seem, the implications of a young person standing up to authority and resisting power were quite revolutionary. And so I think it's more simple, it's more complicated than simply a conservative message being inculcated through the novel. I think its relationship to Pamela is no accident. In some of the most interesting scenes in this novel are scenes of reading in which the heroine walks into a bookstore, sees a young woman reading, a young woman who clearly identifies very strongly with the heroine of a novel, uh, and in which the power of fiction to transform the lives of young women is very much at stake in those scenes. Um, Another way that I think Maria Endress's story is, and the reason why she might not have wanted to be known as a novelist, has to do with the fact that she's writing in English, of course. Um, and she's grows up in a German-speaking family, um, but she, I think, is part of that second generation of German Americans who are seeing English novels as particularly exciting, as offering opportunities that they associated with um, a kind of break with traditional Lutheranism, and that uh, may have offered some of the promise and excitement of the Anglophone world. Um, in doing some other research on Matthew Carey, whose name is spelled with one T, that's correct, and who's pictured here, I was really interested in his relationship to German language audiences, because as we know, German speakers were about a third of Pennsylvanians. And Carey, I think, was very conscious that they were a strong potential market for him as the leading bookseller in the mid-Atlantic world between, let's say, 1780 and 1830. And he has these really interesting epistolary exchanges with German booksellers. And so in reading through the Carey correspondence at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, got really interested in his correspondence with one Gottlob Jungmann, who's in Reading, Pennsylvania. And the one message that Jungmann sends over and over again about his book buyers is that they want more novels, and they want these novels in English. So I think Carey recognized the book market he recognized German Americans as a potential book market, and he was looking at that second generation of German Americans who were excited by the new and perhaps slightly risque world of the English novel. Interestingly, Carey also is selling them English primers to learn the English language, just as he's also selling these communities English novels. So, to turn back to Professor Baker, he, I think, summarizes the case nicely for Maria Endress and sort of picturing her life at this moment as she's writing fiction. When he says, Maria Endress's youthful iconoclasm and desire for female empowerment, her marriage outside the faith at the age of 27, and her subsequent foray into English language novel writing, taken together, represented a kind of declaration of independence from the constraints of traditional Lutheranism. I think we can ask some questions about this statement, about how long this independence lasted for Mary Endress Ralston. She did end up moving back with her father and her brother Christian when they moved to Easton, Pennsylvania together around 1807. And she does remain in her father and her brother's orbit for at least through the rest of her father's life. He dies in 1810, and she's at least for a while kind of within a couple of miles of her famous brother at this time period. So I'm not sure how far she gets away from Lutheranism for very long, but we do have these fascinating records that Chris Phillips has found in digitizing the library records of Easton. So we know exactly what Mary Ralston was reading in the second decade of the 19th century. One of those like fascinating things to see. And oh, she's still reading Charles Brockden Brown. So in my concluding section of this talk, I wanted to turn to the actual fiction and look at how these novels are constructed and make a small argument about how they relate to GSP priorities in the time that it's being written. So I want to start with a short piece that we think Mary Ralston wrote for the Ladies' Monitor. And I think it's interesting evidence about how Mary Endress Ralston is adopting and also rejecting her German family experience, about how she's continuing key themes that the GSP were taking up, but also at the same time turning away from those themes. So let me just start by describing the story, and you'll see from the slide a brief summary of this story. It's about 2,500 words. It's called A Tale of Truth. It appears in the Ladies' Monitor, where wealthy young French villager Aldemund is a Huguenot who's lured to Paris by the promise of urban pleasure. He forgets his father's warning to keep his mouth shut about his religious faith. When he can't resist mocking the Virgin Mary, Aldemund is hounded by angry Catholics in Paris. He's sheltered by a kindly Schweitzer who is then killed. Aldemund flees France, knowing that he will not be safe from Catholics until he reaches Italy. Okay. So that's the substance of the story. And my comment on this story is that it reflects a kind of authorial immaturity that can kind of tell us something about the evolution of Ralston's literary imagination. This is probably a tale that Mary Endress Ralston could have heard from her mother, who was a Huguenot refugee, and I think a German play on words is the core of the story. The case of Aldemund is the case of a guy who cannot keep his mund shut. He cannot keep his mouth shut. And there's a German language basis to the story, I think. there's also kind of geographical fuzziness to it. There's a funny way that fleeing to Italy might not be the smartest decision if you're trying to escape Catholics. There's a kind of lack of realism in the story. And there's also a little moral lesson that's tacked on at the end, where Ralston writes, Aldemund is still living and will regret to the hour of his death not having acted consistently with his father's advice. The life of his excellent friend would not then have fallen a sacrifice to his imprudent confidence, and he would have saved himself many hours of remorse and bitter reflection. So we have a little story with a moral, characters are evil or good. It's very simplified, geographically quite uninteresting, or maybe confusing. Maybe interesting because confusing. Now let's contrast that with Monima. And I'm not saying that I don't have any evidence that she wrote them in this particular order. I'm just trying to understand how the writer of this story could write something as complex and nuanced as Monima. In the first part of Monima, and they're not sectioned off into parts, I'm just going to arbitrarily say there's a first part, second part, and third part, but I think you'll see why this organization of the novel makes sense. Um, this is a novel of about 200 pages, which conveys a rich sense of place. We get a very realistic sense of the urban world of Philadelphia around the year 1800. People are complex. They're not black and white. There are good, rich people, and there are evil, corrupt, poor people in this novel. There are good native-born Americans and evil immigrants and vice versa. It's not a world of black and white, in other words. There's not a very obvious moral lesson. Instead, we're in a world where people are diverse, and in many ways, economically, linguistically, ethnically. Philadelphia is geographically a very small place, as you can see from the map. The people are concentrated toward the Delaware River, and the entire urban metropolis is divided between that and the Schuylkill. It's a dense place where people are rubbing shoulders with those who speak different languages, who are of different ethnicities and races, of very different means. So it's diverse economically, linguistically, ethnically. And our heroine, Monima, is a beggar girl whose family background is one of wealth and affluence, but she's now desperately poor, and winter is coming, and she's trying to figure out how to support her family, so she turns to begging. She's persecuted by a hostile yet wealthy neighbor named Ursula Santine. Ursula Santine sends Monima and her father to a workhouse, and imprisons them in a house in the suburbs for a while. Ursula's husband, as it turns out, is an old friend of Fontainebleau, but they don't reunite for a long time. So in this dense world that Ralston gives us, we see these family relationships being explored and eventually revealed. In the second part of the novel, we have a long flashback to European settings and then to a Caribbean setting. And this is where I'd argue we're back in the world of A Tale of Truth, in which instead of realism, what we get is fantasy, either developed through Ralston's imagination because she's reading newspaper reports about events in France or in Santo Domingo, or because she's heard family lore from her parents and other German relatives. And this is a world that's not rendered in any kind of realistic way. We have kind of very sort of trademarks of the ancien regime in France, the Bastille figures in the story, dueling, lettres de cachet, torture devices, etc., are used by Pierre, the novel's villain, to torture and torment the Fontainebleau family. And it's rendered in a very compelling but also very abstract way. It's not realistic. It's not based on sensory experience. Instead, we have a kind of it's sort of fantastical. It's fun, but it doesn't feel particularly grounded in reality. And this is where I think we have the sort of the family lore and legend playing into Endress's account of um, or descriptions in the novel. And then in the conclusion of the novel, in the third part of the novel, um, we're back in Pennsylvania. We're back in Philadelphia. A yellow fever epidemic has happened. That summer. It's probably the summer of 1798. There's a deep sense of realism and urban realism in this novel at this point. Pierre Nenoir, who had tormented the Fontainebleau family back in France, is now determined to destroy the remaining Fontainebleau family members. He wants to get Monsieur Fontainebleau, we never get his first name, by the way, the father, into prison, and he wants to seduce Monima, who's a 16-year-old girl, our heroine. He makes Ursula his mistress and then has Monima forcibly committed to a hospital under false claims of insanity. And then he later engineers her father's arrest on fabricated charges. Following Ursula's death, Pierre lures the Fontainebleaus to a country estate. This is the Pamela part of the novel, through an intermediary, and ultimately bursts in, attempting to rape Monima. Monima shoots him, but he still lives to torment the family for a few more chapters until he dies at the end. Back in Philadelphia, Monima faces further exploitation. Working for Pierre's servant, she is prevented from earning better wages. Pierre uses ethnic prejudice to have Fontainebleau falsely accused of theft. Eventually, the servant recants her testimony, and the mayor clears Monima and Fontainebleau's name. At the end of the novel, Monima regains the family fortune and marries Sonneton Santine. So I'll come back to why he has two names in just a moment. But that's our novel. And I'm going to make the argument that this is connected to some of the concerns of the GSP at this time period. For one thing, she represents Philadelphia as not the multilingual paradise that we remember. Not a place where linguistic diversity is celebrated by everyone, in which, as in, as you might make the argument for the religious version of multilingualism, where translation is a sacred activity. A way of getting at the unity of human languages. In the secular world of Monima, instead, we find tremendous intolerance for people who do not speak English. And even worse, we find many unscrupulous actors who take advantage of immigrants' lack of knowledge of English. This is a key theme in the novel, as over and over again, non-Anglophones are mistreated because they can't speak the language and they can't understand. They're not familiar with the culture. Ralston is very sensitive to the way that immigrants face the plight of not knowing how to navigate the linguistic and legal systems of Philadelphia. So these are just a few quotations from the novel that I think are representative, that give you an idea about the struggles that these immigrants face because they don't speak the language. And this reminds me that, as I'm reading this part of the novel, of the way that the GSP had been arguing for a long time, that the city's mayor, the Philadelphia mayor, bore special responsibility for the welfare of Germans in the city. The GSP had argued, for example, that Philadelphia needed a mayor who was bilingual. But more important, they needed to protect minorities from the tyranny of authority. Some public recognition of German as an official language even needed to be made, some argued. they pointed out that family separation was a problem for immigrants. In a GSP petition of 1785 um, that we've transcribed, they argued that the Pennsylvania legislature needed to make sure that the city authorities could represent linguistic minorities in the city. They wanted to make sure that the names of German passengers are not so badly spelt in the mayor's register book that their relations who made search in that book could not find the true names of their friends. Um, they also said it may be of great importance to a man and his posterity to have his name and circumstance properly registered in the country he comes to settle. Um, and to guard those foreigners from all imposition and wrong, which may be possibly contrived by people who would take advantage of them, right? So these are important themes in this novel that even though it's not a novel about Germans, and in fact, it's really a novel about French immigrants who uh, can't speak the English language. It's continuing many of the same themes that the GSP had been harping on in its political activities during this period. It's also mirrored by that part of the novel that is the kind of reunion plot that I was mentioning earlier. I was saying that the kindly benefactor who will eventually marry Monima and will help the family out of their poverty. He goes by two names. He has the name Sonneton and the name Santine. Um, the reason why the Fontainebleaus don't reunite with Sonneton um, is that they can't find his name in the city records or the city directory. His French name is Sonneton. Don't ask me why that's more authentically French than the name Santine. But according by the on the novel's account, Sonneton's name has been misspelled as Santine by the English-speaking American authorities, and for that reason, Monsieur Fontainebleau can't reunite with his old friend and the man who will eventually save the family from their crushing poverty. Um, I mean, apparently Endress's family spoke French as well, but I also wonder about the spelling of Fontainebleau, and it doesn't seem particularly French either. But that's another thing to think about. Um, so um, so even though the novel does not represent German characters, I think it continues many of the themes that we've seen in GSP records and some of the priorities of the GSP as it's undertaking its political and social activities in the late 18th century, early 19th century. Um, so to sum up, the need for official recognition of languages other than English in the United States, the problem of family separation, um, the stigmatization of immigrants. As you can see, this novel bears no relation at all to the United States in the present day. It's merely a historical curiosity, but nonetheless, I hope you will maybe think about reading it, picking up a copy, and thank you for your attention and a special Öffentlicher Dank to my friends in the GSP transcription group for without which these records wouldn't be available to me and to other researchers. So it's been really enriching to think about the relation of those records to the novel that we have just edited and made available to readers. So I invite your questions and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Len. That was so interesting. That is really great. Um, Wonderful. I think we'll probably have some questions. If anyone wants to raise their hand, maybe I can put this in a view where I can see people. Oh, Jean, go ahead.
Okay. Actually, two questions. Number one about the reception by anybody from the French community might have an interest if you want to comment on that
Mhm.
briefly. And then number two, even on the front page, it says, I was surprised why this line about founded on fact.
Mhm. Yeah.
Was that to give credence to the author had done some kind of research, or were there rumors that about how recent immigrants were being treated, etc.? What's going on there?
Yeah. Um, I think, yeah, the reception by the French is really interesting to me because they were, thank you, Jean, for the questions. Uh, I think part of my theory as to why she's writing about French characters rather than German ones is that there are a lot of French emigres in Philadelphia at this time, and their stories are all over the papers, and there's a lot of cultural interest in those stories. And as an aristocratic immigrant herself, I think she's identifying a lot with those French with those stories of French immigrants. Um, as to the French reception, I'm not sure. I don't know actually what contemporary French readers would have thought. Um, but it's an interesting question. I don't know. Um,
Or even today, how the Alliance Francaise, for instance, they may be very interested in your report.
yeah. Certainly. Um, yeah. I mean, I think about the picture of Philadelphia that Francois Furstenberg gives us in his book, When the United States Spoke French, which is a really stimulating study of the French in 1790s in the United States, where these are very wealthy planters who've just come to Philadelphia, but they're also very, they're really they kind of suddenly experience poverty. And that's this kind of story of downward mobility that I think resonates with Monima. Um, about the question of founded on fact, I think there she's just I think she's just trying to repel the criticism that fiction is unrelated to reality. And I think it's a sort of standard tag that you see in a lot of fiction of the time. Like this is a real life story. And I don't know to what extent reports of the suffering of indentured servants, particularly Germans, was being reported at this time. I'm not entirely sure of how much that was in the newspapers of the year 1802. I don't know. Yeah.
I wonder, have you been down to the Horner Library physically, or are you
Yeah.
doing
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
this online?
No, yeah, I've been down there. Yeah, yes, I have.
Hmm.
Yeah.
How,
Yeah.
how did you make the connection with us?
Um, I was at the McNeil Center for a year in Philadelphia as a as a faculty scholar, and so at some point during that year, I came by the Harner Library, and I'd also heard on the website there was this transcription group, and a couple of years earlier, I'd been in the Moravian University's German transcription or German handwriting course.
Mm,
So I thought, oh, before I forget all of this, I should get involved with a group that does this regularly every week. And I've managed to keep up with it. And yeah. So that's how I've been involved. Yeah, and I'm hoping to be back in Philadelphia sometime soon.
great.
I saw Steffi had her hand up.
Len, thanks for the lovely talk and this introduction for me into this novel I've never heard about. Super fascinating. I wanted to ask you about the relationship to of the story itself to Brockton Brown and Brockton Brown's Ormond, especially. I mean, I
Mhm.
think you said earlier you think she also copied segments from Pamela.
Mhm.
I mean, and if I remember, I think the Brockton Brown is earlier. So is this a novel that devours other novels,
Mhm.
copies, or yeah?
That's a wonderful way to put it, Steffi. And thank you. Great to see you. Thank you for coming. Yeah, absolutely. This novel is certainly a response to Brockton Brown's Ormond, which has a similar family configuration, a daughter who grows who doesn't have a mother to raise her and is raised by her father, who's very interested in supporting her education. Um,
Isn't he
and
also French?
he is not, but he's fascinated by, I think, by French culture. There's
There's a
a,
big.
yeah, 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 it's a big part of the novel. Um, so, I mean, I know, we know that, Endress Ralston was reading Charles Braxton Brown because Chris Phillips, our mutual friend, transcribed the Easton Library records, and we know that. I mean, that's a little bit later, but she's certainly fascinated by Brockton Brown, and she sees Brockton Brown's success, and I think the basic story configuration is similar. But I think your larger point that this is a novel that devours other novels is a beautiful way of putting it. It's a very metafictional work in some ways. I think our favorite scene in the novel I'll just speak for myself, is the scene in a bookstore where we have a female employee in the bookstore who's reading novels, and she says aloud to Monima, "I really wish I were a heroine in a novel." She says that to the heroine of the novel. And there's a lovely scene as the chapter unfolds where we see a group of men who are conversing in this bookstore and are talking about the latest fiction, and they're so excited by these stories that they're reading. Later in the novel, we find that Monima is an avid consumer of novels. She's particularly fascinated by the La Nouvelle Eloise, Rousseau's novel, and so it's yes, I think this is very much the work of a reader of fiction. This is somebody who's fascinated by her immersion in novels, and I think she's asking herself, why can't I do this? Well, let me do this too. Yeah.
Frank?
Len, thank you for this terrific talk. It really is great. Um, I have two observations. One is this is a a woman half German, half French, but she's writing about a French experience in Philadelphia in 1803, a period when Philadelphia was flooded with a huge number of French arriving from the Haitian, who were refugees from the Haitian Revolution, and wonder whether this makes it the Frenchness particularly popular and sort of engaging as a topic at this particular moment. But the timing lends itself to thinking about that. There was one other specific point. You asked why Mary Endress did not go to the German Society for help, speculating that the German Society gave scholarships to her brother to attend the University of Pennsylvania, but those scholarships were not available to women. And of course, schools
Yeah.
weren't available, colleges were not available to women at all at that time. Well, actually, there were a couple of women at Penn early on, but
Interesting.
Later on, the charitable purposes of the German society were limited to people who had been in the country 1 year or less. Certainly under the Agentur later, the records of the Agentur later in the century indicate that people were systematically, automatically excluded if they had been in the country for more than a year. The purpose of the German society being to assist new immigrants, which would have excluded her. And perhaps she knew that rule, and that's the reason she didn't go seeking assistance in the first place. The scholarship thing was a completely different program. The main program of assistance was limited to people who had been in the country for a year or less, at least later on. I don't know what it was in 1803.
I don't either. Maria would know, but I don't know if she can answer because I can't see her. But Maria would probably know the answer to that since she's worked in that Agentur. My impression is that was later when they had such a huge influx that they
Had to limit.
had to limit the aid they were giving. But there are plenty of women who are listed in the minute books as having been aided, but were they all widows?
I don't think they were
The
all
ones.
that's what I remember, but yeah, I mean there was her sister-in-law, the widow
Mhm.
is in there in the 1812, 1813.
Yeah, yeah,
And she's certainly been in the country for much longer than a year.
right.
Um, hmm. But Frank, I think your points are wonderful about the excitement around and the kind of cultural, sorry, not to change the topic, but the Haitian Revolution in 1803 is absolutely grips the U.S. Print sphere in a way that I think the plight of German Americans is not so much headline news, but certainly Haitian Revolution is. Everybody has an opinion and is thinking about it. So it makes sense that she would seize on a topic that is really very much in the public imagination. And I don't know how much she's working from firsthand experience. I really know so little about the German presence in the Caribbean, other than the Moravians and, what John Sensbach has done. But I think this may have been more ripped from the headlines than based on any personal experience, um, or family experience. I'm fascinated that there were women at Penn. That's really interesting. I'd love to talk to you more about that too. Great.
Maybe tomorrow.
Yeah.
Any other transcription group? Any last questions? Any last question? Otherwise, I think we're getting about out of time. But okay, thank you, Len, so much. That was fascinating and very pleased that you were willing to do it for us. So thanks again.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
And thanks everyone for joining us, and hope to see you at another library lecture soon. Good night.
Thank you.